As someone who makes a living as an illustrator, and someone who also just draws for fun, I spend a huge amount of time drawing. A borderline ridiculous amount of time drawing. And even though I have a big fancy Wacom Cintiq, or Wacom, I think it's technically Wacom, but I'm still not comfortable saying it. Wacom? Wacom. I got a Wacom. I got a Wacom. Even though I have a big fancy Cintiq, I still do most of my drawing on my iPad. I don't know why, I just find it a little more comfortable, a little more natural, a little more intuitive. For a while, I mainly used Procreate to do my drawing, but more recently I've switched to Adobe Fresco. What's your preferred drawing app? Let me know in the comments, I'm curious. It seems like most people are big Procreate fans. If I was forced to use one of these apps over the other, it would be fine. The drawing experience is great in both, and in most ways the apps work the same. There definitely are some differences though. In this video, I'm going to talk about why I prefer Adobe Fresco. My comparison will be based around the way I work and my illustration style. As a result, I'll just be talking about the things that I use and the things that relate to my workflow. I say that because I know that people will mention the 3D features that Procreate has.
Hey, what about the 3D stuff?
But to be honest, I have no experience with them because it doesn't really relate to the way I work. So I'm not going to talk about them. I'm going to talk about the differences between the two apps within specific categories: drawing, coloring, vector art, animation, files, price, and then other considerations. I'll timestamp the different categories in the description, so if there's something specific that you want to know in regards to one of these categories, you can just skip to that area. Let's get into it. When I'm starting out drawing in a new app, I usually just look for a brush that does what I want it to do, which is pretty simple. I just want a brush that sort of imitates a sign pen or just like a regular Papermate Flare or something, just something simple like this, just a felt tip pen. When I first started using Procreate, I remember not really liking any of the stock brushes or whatever brushes they come with. There's plenty of controls to customize the brushes to your settings, but to be honest, I think I'm just too stupid to understand how they work. I've tried to mess up the settings and I usually just come up with something that is worse than when I started. Some people are magicians with brushes. I am not one of those people. It took me a while to get into Procreate, and I think when I first started using it more is when I found some brushes that I liked. I ended up using my friend Ryan Hamrick's lettering brushes to do most of my work. He's got a whole bunch of brushes in the set, but to be honest, I only used 2 of them because they were very similar to what I was looking for, something that felt like a sign pen or just like a felt tip pen. Those were his Ink Solid and his Ink Solid Streamline brushes. Pretty much all the line work that I ever did in Procreate was done with those 2 brushes. One of the benefits to Adobe Fresco is access to Photoshop brushes, specifically all the amazing brushes that Kyle Webster makes. Because of that, it was very easy for me to find a brush that was readily available within the app that worked great for me. I didn't have to go and seek out a brush to purchase and hope that it worked. The free version of Fresco has, I think, 200 brushes available, and then the premium version, you can just get whatever Photoshop brushes that you want that are available, which includes all of Kyle Webster's collection, which is just unbelievably large. It is huge. It has everything you could ever want. Although this video is about why I prefer Adobe Fresco, there are some things about the drawing experience in Procreate that I prefer to Fresco. One of those things is the streamline effect that it has for some of the brush settings. The streamline effect smooths out your curves as you draw. The 2 brushes that I mentioned, the Ink Solid and the Ink Solid Streamline, are essentially the same brush. They look the same, but the Streamline one has that streamline effect cranked all the way up. So if you want to do like a long flowy line, which happens a lot in my work, it is super nice to do that. So if I'm doing some script lettering or just want to do a nice smooth curve, I just use the Streamline brush. And then if I'm doing something that has a little more like quick detail or rough angular shapes, I use the regular Ink Solid brush, and the lines end up looking the same, but when I need it to be smooth, it's smooth. When I don't want it to be smooth, I use the other brush. Fresco does have a similar thing. It's called smoothing, and you can turn that up on any of your brushes. The ability to just like turn it up and down very easily without changing the brush, I think is really cool. But the smoothing effect works a little differently than the streamline. I think, to explain it, the streamline effect in Procreate seems to sort of correct after the fact, so there's a little bit of a lag, whereas the smoothing effect in Fresco sort of smooths it out as it's going. I find it's easier to get the line that I want using the streamline in Procreate, but to be honest, it's pretty close. Now that I've been using Fresco all the time, it's not as much of an issue for me. The other thing that's a little better in Procreate is its ability to snap shapes. So that's just like if you draw a rough circle and hold for a second, it'll pop into a perfect circle, or at least a smooth circle. So if you were doing like an oval, it wouldn't force you to do a perfect circle. It would just make it a smooth shape. You can also do that with like squares and triangles and also lines. Fresco does have snapping lines, so if you want a straight line, you just hold and it'll snap. But Procreate also lets you snap curved lines. So if you have a curved line that you just want to be pretty smooth, you can hold and it'll sort of snap and smooth out that curve, which is something that Fresco doesn't have. That said, Fresco is updating all the time. There's literally new updates to the app constantly. So I imagine those features are probably something that'll come, because I know a lot of people really like them. So I wouldn't be surprised if Fresco adds these in the near future. I usually color my illustrations on a separate layer below my line work. I find this gives me better results in terms of not having any like weird spaces where there's not color. And also it gives me some flexibility with the artwork if I want to change the color or if I just need the line work separately. Fresco has this really great feature called reference layers, where you can set a layer to be the reference. And what that means is you would take your line work, set it as a reference, and then you can go in and color on other layers. So if you make a new layer and you use the paint bucket, it'll fill based on the line work layer. This way you can have nice tight fills for all your color on its own layer without having to do any extra work. This is super helpful because I can just go ahead and like use the paint bucket in most applications to just fill in areas of my drawing, and that'll all be on a separate layer, as opposed to when I'm working in Procreate, I have to make a new layer and then paint in the color and pay attention, staying close to the edges. Technically, I could use like the selection tool and select areas within the drawing and then fill in on a separate layer. That would sort of work in some cases, but if your line work is a little bit rough, there's some texture to it, you end up getting like a little white hairline around the edges, which isn't ideal. And speaking of the paint bucket tool, there's no paint bucket tool in Procreate. I really like having the paint bucket tool. It was weird saying paint bucket tool that many times in a row. I think it's so much faster and more convenient to use that to just sort of tap in areas that you want to fill, as opposed to in Procreate, you have to go to your color swatch in the top corner and then drag it to where you need it to go. This is especially annoying if you're doing like a tight area. You gotta like zoom in and then drag it over and get it right in the spot. Whereas you can tap a little bit more accurately than you can dragging your finger. So paint bucket tool, that's a plus. Even before I fully switched over to using Fresco full-time, I was using it for its vector brushes. Before Fresco, Adobe had two iPad drawing apps. It was Adobe Draw and Adobe Sketch. Adobe Draw was vector-based and Adobe Sketch was raster-based. So I used Adobe Draw a lot when I needed to create vector artwork for some of my client work. When Fresco was released, those two apps became superfluous and went away because Fresco combined all of their features and more. For some of my client work, it's necessary to send vector files, so the ability to draw directly in vector on my iPad is a big deal for me. In the past, I had two options when vector artwork was necessary. I could do all my line work and then live trace it in Illustrator or use some other app. Live trace in Illustrator used to not be that great, so I'd had to use this app called like Coco Potrace. Live trace is pretty good now, but it's still a whole extra step that you'd have to do where you have to create the line work and then live trace it, and it's still, you lose a little bit of fidelity no matter how good that live trace is. The other option was just to draw directly in Adobe Illustrator using the blob brush. And that drawing experience is not ideal for the work that I do. I can make it work, but it's still a little bit of a compromise. Drawing vector artwork in Adobe Fresco is just natural, easy, and definitely a game changer for me. Sadly, Procreate has no vector abilities. Oh, hey, just a quick thing. If you're finding this information helpful, can you just go ahead and smash the living heck out of the like button? Just run down there and just hit it. Just hit it real hard. Seriously though, it's super helpful in getting this video seen by new people. And as a new channel starting out, that's crucial because my videos aren't getting seen by that many people right now. So, you know, maybe they will. Maybe by the time you see this, just the views will be through the roof. So, and that'll be thanks to you. So, thanks. It's fun and easy to create frame-by-frame animations in both Adobe Fresco and Procreate. Procreate's Animation Assist makes frame-by-frame animation super simple, very intuitive. It just uses your layers as frames within your animation. There's two aspects of animating in Procreate that I actually do prefer over Fresco. Procreate gives you the ability to change the color of how your onion skins preview when you're working in the timeline. So you can make one, let's say red, and the next one blue. So then when you're previewing them, you can tell which frame is the previous frame and which is the next frame. When they're both just like gray or the color of your illustration, it can get confusing on what's before and what's after. This is helpful when I'm making in-between frames when I'm morphing something, because it's very easy to tell the difference between the previous and the next frame, and then what I need to do in the middle to make that a seamless transition. The other thing I like about animating in Procreate is the ability to group layers within a frame. So if you combine some layers, that'll show up as a single frame in your timeline. Fresco is arguably in a completely different league when it comes to animation. To start, each layer gets its own timeline, which means you can have a separate animation on every single layer of your document if you wanted to. This allows you to create a much more complex and dynamic animation because you can have things moving in different ways and at different speeds. That alone makes Adobe Fresco much more capable, but on top of that, it also has motion paths. So in addition to frame by frame, you can now create a path for an object to move along. Better yet, that object can also be a frame by frame animation. So you can have a frame by frame loop and then move that loop along a path. Imagine animating a bird where you have a sequence where the bird is flapping its wings, and then you take that sequence and then you draw a path across your document, and now you have a bird flying across your screen flapping its wings. Super simple, and something that would be much more difficult in Procreate. Motion paths have a ton of different features that you can control. One of them is speed, which is pretty self-explanatory. You can control how fast something moves across the screen. You can control that with a setting, but it also gives you the ability to draw how fast you want something to go. So you can literally draw how fast something should move along a path. So if you wanted something to like fall quickly, you could draw fast and then maybe slow forward. And then your object would go real fast and then go slow. It also gives you the ability to add multiple objects that you're animating into a path. For example, with that bird we talked about, you could add multiples and have a whole bunch of different birds. The default setting would have them all just in a straight line, but there's also options to scatter and randomize so that you could spread them out among your document. You can also add multiple paths. You can just draw another path and then there'd be just more of the same thing. You could have just a giant flock of birds in a matter of seconds. Isn't that what we all want? In Fresco, you can do things easily and intuitively that would be super complicated to do in even the most advanced full-on animation applications. As someone who does a little bit of animation in addition to my illustration work, if I have to do something that's a little bit more complicated or involves timing with sound or music, I still do that in Photoshop. neither Fresco or Procreate is a replacement for Photoshop when it comes to more complex animations. So that's just something to keep in mind. You're not going to be able to create a full-on animated cartoon with either of these apps. That's just not what they're for. They're drawing apps that have great tools to add motion to your illustration work. I think that's a better way to think of it. Procreate saves files locally on your iPad within the app. I didn't realize this at first, and this really bit me in the ass a long time ago. I had upgraded my iPad, got a new one, and I had backed up everything, I thought, and deleted the old iPad to get rid of it. And then I re-downloaded Procreate thinking that all my illustrations would be in there, but they were gone. This is sort of, I should have double checked and not just assumed. If you are going to get a new iPad, just make sure that you have backed up those files. More recently, I was upgrading my iPad again, and I remembered this situation. So I was like, I'm not going to let that happen again. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, I'm not going to lose my Procreate files. So I went and looked up how to back up my files and realized I had to go in and just do it manually, which wouldn't be a big deal if I didn't draw like a psychopath and have just thousands of files. So I had to kind of go in and select all of them, blah, 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 and just wait for them to slowly back up. I eventually got them all saved, uploaded. When I got my new iPad, I didn't want to just bring them all in because I didn't need them all to be within the app, and I wasn't using Procreate regularly anymore. Anyway, the first time I needed a file that I had previously created in Procreate, when I went to go get it, I went to import the file from my cloud, and none of my files were named because I'm stupid. But to be fair, you just make a new document, you just hit plus, and you start drawing in Procreate. It's not intuitive, doesn't prompt you to name your files. It's not like when you're working on a computer and you make a new Photoshop file. Whatever, I should have named my files, but I didn't. The other issue is they don't even show thumbnails. So in the cloud, I just see the Procreate app. So I just have thousands of files called like Untitled 5796er and no thumbnail. So I would just have to load them all one at a time and hope that I could find something. So I don't know, if you use Procreate, name your files, back them up. On the other hand, Adobe Fresco uses Creative Cloud and automatically saves all of your files in the cloud. This is great. For one, it eliminates the issue I had with Procreate, but the other great thing about this is if you're someone whose workflow includes going back and forth between your computer and Photoshop and Illustrator and Fresco, when you're on your computer and you open up one of the Adobe apps, you can just see all of your Creative Cloud files right there. So if I draw something in Fresco and I go over to Photoshop on my computer, go to open a file, I can see that illustration right there ready to go, so I can just pop it open. I could edit that file in Photoshop, save it, and then when I'm back in Fresco, I can open up the new version of that file. So if you wanted to do something in Photoshop and then go back and draw some more in Fresco, you can go back and forth seamlessly, which pretty fantastic. Procreate sort of wins in the price category, but only sort of. It may actually lose depending on your situation. Procreate costs $9.99. It's just like a one-time fee. Adobe Fresco has a free version that you can just download and start messing around with. The free version works great. It's just limited to a smaller amount of Creative Cloud storage and 200 brushes instead of access to all the available Photoshop brushes, which again includes all of Kyle Webster's brushes, which is insanity. If you want the premium version, which has all the brushes and much bigger iCloud storage, that costs $9.99 a year. It's the same price as Procreate, but it's every year. The reason why I say it may be cheaper than Procreate is if you already have Adobe Creative Cloud, Adobe Fresco is free. It just comes with Creative Cloud. There's also some other bundle options as well. You can get the full version of Photoshop on your desktop and Fresco, and I believe Adobe Portfolio or something like that, and that's like $9.99 a month. there's lots of different bundle options with Fresco. But if you're just talking about drawing on your iPad, you don't have Adobe Creative Cloud, you can get Fresco for free and see if that has enough features for you. It very well might. 200 brushes is a lot. So some other considerations. I thought this was going to be a more robust section, but a lot of the other considerations ended up fitting within the other categories. One thing, though, that doesn't is Procreate limits the amount of layers you can have based on your iPad. So if your iPad isn't one of the, like a newer version or has a smaller hard drive, you'll be limited in the amount of layers that it can handle based on the document size. Fresco has no limit on layers. You can have layers until your iPad catches on fire. Another thing to consider is that Procreate is exclusively an iPad app. Fresco, on the other hand, works on the Microsoft Surface in addition to the iPad, which is pretty cool if you use a Microsoft Surface. As I mentioned in the beginning, the overall experience in both apps is very similar. They both do a whole lot of the same things. You can export time-lapse drawings in both apps. They're both really great apps, and you really can't go wrong with either of them. If you're someone who's currently using Procreate and you really like Procreate and you're comfortable with that, and the animation features are not something that you would benefit from, or you don't need to do vector artwork, then I would say there's no reason to switch. But if any of these other features are enticing, I would say come on over to the Fresco side. It's pretty cool over here. Another thing I wanted to touch on is that I think a lot of people maybe tried Fresco really early on and didn't like it, or didn't like it as much as Procreate, and they just sort of wrote it off and thought Fresco isn't for me. But that earlier version of Fresco is really just a start. They've added so much to it and upgraded it just constantly since, and it's really just so much better and more advanced than when it was when it first started. So if you tried Fresco at the very beginning, I really encourage you to try it again. I think it's, well, I just explained why I think it's pretty great. I have no relationship with Adobe, and this isn't sponsored by Adobe. This is just my experience, and I'm sort of explaining what I use. So for me, Adobe Fresco does all the things that I want to do. Anyway, did this make you question your current drawing preference on the iPad? If so, let me know in the comments. I'm really curious if this changed anyone's mind or didn't. Maybe you were like, this proves to me that I like this one way more than this one, whatever one that is. And also, can you just maybe just smash the smash the thumbs. Take your thumb and thumb it. Give me the thumbers. I don't know if it's ever gonna not be weird asking you to like my videos. Feels weird, but I gotta do it because that's the way the YouTube is. I'm a YouTuber now. What's up, guys? Chris here with another illustration tip. I'm posting new illustration and animation content weekly, maybe more as things pick up, but I'm committing myself to weekly for the time being. So if that's relevant to you and you can stand the sound of my voice and the look of my face, then subscribe, because there's going to be more. And good talk.